The deconstruction process is a really important part of the planning process. When we deconstruct 21st century skills, we know that these skills are really important, but they're also really abstract, and they're open to interpretation by both students and teachers. But you might be feeling this way because the deconstruction process is really hard. It's based on backward design, the understanding by design process defined by Wiggins and McTighe, and it also takes from the work of Rick Stiggins, who defines how to develop student ownership in the learning process, which is a very 21st century notion. This step is what makes good design happen. Put time into this step, and the rest of your planning is much easier, even more fun. There's a direct relationship between planning and the learning of your students. When you take the time to deconstruct, you'll have higher levels of learning, especially from your struggling students. So at this point in the deconstruction process, you've already defined one of these 21st century skills that you want to focus on. You might have even broken this down more. For instance, in information, media, and technology literate, there's a lot there. You might just be focusing on being media literate for your 21st century skill. I'm going to start thinking about how I want my students to be strong communicators, and this is going to be the focus of my deconstruction. I'm working on a project for 6th grade, and as I think about 6th graders being strong communicators, I start by thinking about what I want them to know, understand, and be able to do as those strong communicators. I know my communication skills are going to go beyond just talking with each other. That makes me realize that as I deconstruct, I want to be thinking about how students aren't just talking, but thinking about what the other person is saying. Ultimately, I want students to use strong communication skills to build ideas together. I also want to address the misconceptions that students might have about being a strong communicator and make sure that they realize that we're working on their oral language. And I want to make sure that they understand that being a strong communicator is not a one-way street. In addition, I'm looking at the standards for my grade level. 21st century skills are actually integrated into the new standards. And while those standards are very large statements in themselves that need to be deconstructed, they can help me identify a level of rigor at which I would want to make sure that I'm deconstructing at. Based on my rationale, I have found a speaking and listening standard in the ELA Common Core that could help me in thinking about what I want my students to do to develop their strong communication skills. The standard has helped me identify my first deconstruction target. I would need students to be able to reason or evaluate when a speaker's position or claim is supported by reason or evidence. From that reasoning target, I know I need to build some foundation. So going back to the knowledge targets, I am going to make sure that students can define what a claim is. I want to make sure that they understand that claims are supported by reasons and evidence. So I admit it, I'm stuck. I know I want my students to develop strong communication skills by listening and evaluating the arguments of others. But now what do I do? How do I get them there? What would be the steps I could explain to them to allow them to do this evaluation? So I go back into my professional learning network or Google and start searching for ideas. My research gave me some great ideas on how I could develop some concrete skills to help develop the critical thinking skill. For instance, I want students to be able to identify the assumptions that might be in another person's argument. But before they can evaluate that, I want them to create the skill of understanding what a warranted and unwarranted assumption is. That compare and contrast, I think, will help students pick out assumptions in their evaluations. The same goes for logical and illogical reasoning. Before I can help them evaluate that, I want them to develop the skill of identifying or of creating both types of argument. And then finally, I want to make sure that students are looking to see, is there sufficient evidence to support a speaker's claim? These three things put together as steps help students start to realize how to develop the critical thinking. I'm looking back at this standard. Now, I'm not really trying to deconstruct this standard, but it is helping me think about my strong communication skills I want my students to have, and it's helping me identify a level of rigor that would be appropriate in 6th grade. So by looking at the first verb, delineate, it makes me realize that to push my students a little bit more, not only do I want them to do the evaluation, but I want them to be able to explain the difference between two claims made during a discussion. Finally, there's lots of dispositions that I could focus on to help students be successful as strong communicators. But I finally decided that what I want students to do is focus on developing respect for others by paraphrasing and by listening without interruption. I have deconstructed my abstract goal of improving the communication skills of my students. I've done this by using a standard to help me identify a level of rigor for my deconstruction. It's not necessary to use a standard, but it was helpful for me in this thinking. I also used some research to help identify those concrete steps to get to the abstract performance I want students to be able to show me. After I've done my deconstruction, I need to take these smaller targets and bundle them into the learning targets that I will present to my students. I don't want to overwhelm students by giving them each piece of the deconstruction, but rather bundling them gives them that bigger picture of what I'm expecting. When I plan, I'll go back to my deconstruction form and make sure all of my activities are specific to each part of my deconstruction form. But for my students, I want them to understand that they're making claims supported with logical reasons and evidence, and that they have to be able to explain the difference between claims. Looking at our models of SAMR and RAT, we know that technology for the sake of technology doesn't produce a difference that we want in our classroom. So we use the deconstruction form to really evaluate the work that we want students to do and how technology can help us get there. When I look at my deconstruction, the obvious challenge is monitoring as students are developing these oral language skills. I want them to be able to practice, and I want to be able to give feedback on that practice, but I can only listen to one student at a time. So if students are using tools like Audacity, VoiceThread, or Explain Everything, they can create recordings showing me the practice that they're using to develop the strong communication skills, and then I can give them feedback in a way that I could have never done that before. That's a way technology can make a difference in my classroom. When I am finished with deconstruction of a 21st century skill, I should see targets that are applicable to any discipline. Making claims and explaining the difference between two claims works in an ELA classroom, a science classroom, and even in the gymnasium. When you deconstruct, you have a clear definition of the 21st century skill. You create a specific plan or pathway for all students to reach the skill, and this helps most your struggling students. And finally, you will have reasons for each learning activity that you plan for, including the use of technology.